Alright, let's get started with deontology. Deontology is a moral philosophy that postulates that what is right or wrong depends on the act itself. Actions have an intrinsic value and are either right or wrong, period. In the next minutes, we'll talk about 4 slightly different approaches to deontology, all of which focus solely on the act itself. Let's start with Immanuel Kant. Born in 1724, Immanuel Kant was an influential German philosopher who believed that reason is the source of morality. As with all deontologists, Kant assumed that the consequences do not matter at all. Some actions are in themselves intrinsically good or bad, and the results do not justify the means. I'm repeating myself here, but it's very important to understand. Whether an act is right or wrong depends on moral principles and universal laws. Kant argues that there is a single moral obligation, which he called the categorical imperative. Categorical imperatives are derived from the concept of duty, things that you are supposed to do, that you have to do. They are principles that are intrinsically valid. They are good in and of themselves. They must be obeyed in all situations and circumstances. There are no exclusion to this. If our behavior is to observe the moral law, you have to follow the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative provides a test against which actions can be assessed. Now you probably wonder, what is the categorical imperative? Well, there's 3 of them. The first categorical imperative states, act only according to that maxim by which you can also will that it would become a universal law. In short, what is right for one person has to be right for all, and action has to become universal law. The second categorical imperative states, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Again, in plain English, it just means treat others not as a means to your own end. Finally, the third categorical imperative states, every rational being must so act as if he or she were, through his maxim, always a legislating member of a universal kingdom of ends. Again, it's the universal law that Immanuel Kant stressed, that what is right for one has to be right for everybody. Is stealing good? It may be good for you, but if everybody were to steal, it would be bad. The next person we talk about is John Rawls. He was one of the most important political philosophers of the 20th century. He wrote a series of highly influential articles in the 1950s and 1960s that sparked interest of moral and political philosophy on substantive problems about what we ought to do. Again, deontologists, what do we have to do? The subject matter of Rawls' theory of justice is societal practices and institutions. He wanted to find answers to questions such as, is there a way of organizing society that can keep problems within livable limits? Can society be organized around fair principles of cooperation in a way that people would accept? I think his philosophy is more important than ever today, considering how difficult the times are, how organizations struggle, and some organizations take advantage of people struggling. Rawls' original thought is that equality or a fair distribution of advantages needs to be addressed. Specifically, he said that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty of others. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both reasonably expected to be in everyone's advantage and attached to positions and offices open to all. Rawls required the rules of the game to be fair. And I think that's the most important aspect of it. Once society has been organized around a set of fair rules, people can freely play the game without interference. To put Rawls' theory in plain terms, I think we can say that an act is ethical if it involved true freedom of choice and action, was available to all, injured no one, and was of a benefit to some. Again, it's very similar to Kant when you break it down to the basics. But remember that his started from a societal perspective. How can we address injustice in society? The next perspective is the rights perspective. It is again associated with the ideas of Kant and Rawls and is founded on a movement throughout history to overcome basic social injustice and constraints on personal freedom. In line, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a milestone document in the history of human rights. Drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds from all regions of the world, the Declaration was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948 as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. On a side note, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been translated into over 500 different languages and holds the Guinness World Record as the most translated document. That's some achievement, I would say. So, if you have to analyze a scenario and you can see that an action violates one or more articles of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's easy to conclude that the act is not ethical based on deontology. In a similar vein, if you don't remember the individual articles, but you know that the act cannot be generalized to all, that whatever the person did would be devastating to the world if everybody were to do it, you can again generalize that or conclude that it's unethical based on deontology. So let's go back to the different articles. Some of the most important articles of the declarations are the first one: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The second one: everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So this is supposed to apply to all humans. Then I'm going to skip a few. I'm going to go to Article 9. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest and detention or exile. So these articles basically cover things we learned about Kant. For example, the second categorical imperative and Rawls' theory of justice. Another interesting article is Article 12, which states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence. But do you really care about your privacy? And to what extent do you care about your privacy? Is there anybody who does not have a smartphone? Whether you have an Android phone or an iPhone or whatever else is out there, your data is being collected, accumulated, and sold. But luckily, this interference in your privacy is not arbitrary, since you probably read those 50, 100 pages of fine print and accepted the terms and conditions. Another interesting article is Article 16 that I would like to discuss. It states that man and woman of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion, have the right to marry and to found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution. Now, sounds fairly straightforward, but what happens when cultural norms disagree with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights? How do you feel about arranged marriages? A few years back I was in India and a cousin of my friend got engaged. Well, his parents basically set everything up and he just had to say yes. Is this a violation of a human right? It's a tricky question, but it's something that we'll discuss further in our online discussions. So the final deontological approach is called justice approach. The justice approach uses, again, universal principles to judge persons, situations, and dilemmas in a fair, objective, equitable, and impartial manner. There are only 4 types of justice principles. So first and foremost, we need to check if procedural justice is given. Procedural justice looks at the fairness and transparency of the process. In theory, the legal system is a very good example. You know that if a police officer catches you breaking the law, he or she does not just randomly assign a fine to you or imprison you, but he follows a process that is outlined in the law books. You may or may not saw on TV that police officers tell criminals their Miranda rights before arresting them. This is again to ensure that the arrest follows a transparent and fair process. By the way, if you ever get in trouble in Canada, do not expect a Canadian police officer to talk about Miranda rights before you get arrested, because that is simple US thing. So once we know whether procedural justice is given, we can check for distributive justice. Distributive justice ensures that equals are being treated equally, and of course that non-equals are not being differently. Quick example, if I drive, let's say 120 kilometers an hour on a Canadian highway, which is 20% faster than the posted speed limit, I should get the same fine as someone who also drove 120 kilometers an hour, regardless whether the other person knows the police officer or is prettier than me. Distributive justice also tells us that men and women need to be paid equally for the same work. So while distributive justice focuses on the people, equals should be treated equally, retributive justice focuses on the act. More severe wrongdoings need to be punished more sternly. You should get a higher fine when you get caught driving 150 kilometers an hour on the highway than when you get caught driving only 120 kilometers an hour. Finally, we have compensatory justice. Compensatory justice is very simple and requires that the victims of the wrongdoings are being compensated and appropriately compensated. If you use a justice approach to analyze a case, you should always look at all 4 types of justice. Don't simply stop after you found one that is violated. Here's a great example. A very short case. Imagine that a manager hires her body instead of a more qualified applicant. After the senior manager notices that, he tells the manager to be more objective the next time. Now, let's analyze this short case. First, we're going to check for procedural justice. Is the process or the hiring process fair and transparent? Even though we don't have many facts, based on what we know, I think it's safe to say that the process was not fair or transparent. Because otherwise, the manager would have hired the more qualified candidate. Hence, procedural justice doesn't seem to be given. But that's not it. We shouldn't just stop right there and say, it was unethical. There's 3 more justice approaches that we should look at. So next, we're going to look if equals have been treated equally. Did the more qualified candidate get the job? And the answer is very straightforward. No. The more qualified candidate did not get the job. Hence, not only was procedural justice violated, distributive justice has been violated too. So next, we're going to go and look at how was the wrongdoing punished. Well, as you remember, we don't know anything about punishment. There was not really any punishment. So we could argue that retributive justice was not given either. And finally, we need to know who is the injured party. In this case, it's again very simple, the person who did not get the job. He or she did not get any compensation for the loss. Hence, compensatory justice was also violated. Many students look at procedural justice, see that it has been violated, conclude that the case was unethical. And you are correct. But, as I said, you have to apply all 4 justice principles. Now that you know how you will be graded, I have established procedural justice. Let's see if I can also follow through with all other justice approaches once I grade your assignments and exams. So we have learned 4 slightly different approaches to deontology. While they appear to be straightforward, there are several challenges. First and foremost, the principles at stake are sometimes difficult to identify. And not only are they difficult to identify, often they conflict with one another, as there are hardly any situations that are driven by one principle. During war, should you defend your country or maybe your family if it means that you have to kill other humans? Killing clearly violates deontology, but at the same time, ensuring that your family is safe seems to be a valid universal law too. Here we have conflicting principles. Again, which one is more important? In addition, we are primed to accept legal rights as moral rights. But that is not always the case. Think about the legalization of cannabis in Canada. A few years ago, it was illegal to consume cannabis, and violators faced hefty fines. Did the change in law change your moral rights? Was the law wrong at first, and is it right now? Or was it the other way around? Imagine you cross the border to the United States, and you may end up in jail for doing something that's absolutely legal in Canada. So it's very difficult to differentiate between moral rights and legal rights. In addition, can you think of an action that is clearly ethical at all times in every situation, according to deontology, this is very tricky. Well, that's about all I have to say about deontology. Please let me know your questions during the online discussions.